legendary warship lost to the depths. Over 800 sailors left drifting on the open ocean, battling dehydration, exposure to the elements, and hundreds of hungry sharks. And for over 70 years, the final resting place of the sunken vessel was one of history's greatest mysteries.
At the bottom of the South Atlantic, the wreck of a Nazi warship has been hiding for over 80 years. And it was a wreck that was once a terror to Allied waters during World War II. But when salvage divers finally reached its remains, what they found stunned everyone. This wasn't just a ship, but a story frozen in time, waiting to resurface. What secrets were sealed inside this forgotten beast? And why does it still matter today? Join us as we dive deep into the mystery of the Admiral Graf Spee, the pocket battleship that broke the rules. The Admiral Graf Spee wasn't like the other warships that roamed the seas during World War II. It was smaller than a traditional battleship, but it carried firepower that could sink almost anything that came its way.
The first half of the story is a classical naval battle. The second half of the story is a story of guile and deception, and perhaps one of the biggest bluffs of the Second World War.
Germany didn't just build it to defend their coastlines. They built it to hunt. And because the Treaty of Versailles placed strict limits on what Germany could build after World War I, they found a clever way around it. They didn't call it a battleship. They called it a cruiser, but it didn't behave like one. The truth is, this ship was a quiet rebellion against everything the post-war treaties tried to control. On paper, it fits within the rules. But in reality, it had 6 massive 11-inch guns that could punch holes in ships from miles away. And it wasn't powered by steam like most other warships at the time. Instead, it ran on diesel engines that gave it far more range than anyone expected. That meant it could stay at sea longer, hunt down merchant ships, and disappear before anyone knew what hit them. But here's the most intriguing part. Germany launched the Graf Spee in 1934, but it wasn't until 1939 that the ship showed the world what it could really do. As the war in Europe loomed closer, the German Navy quietly sent the Graf Spee into the Atlantic, just weeks before the first shots of World War II were fired. While most people were focused on what was happening in Poland, this ship was already sailing far away from Europe, toward the shipping lanes in the South Atlantic. The goal wasn't to pick a fight with enemy warships, it was to disrupt British trade. The Graf Spee was built for that exact mission. It had the range, the speed, and the weapons to intercept merchant ships, sink them, and vanish. It was a floating ghost, and it moved like one. Over a short period, it managed to destroy 9 Allied merchant ships without getting caught. But what's more surprising is that not one crew member from any of those ships died. That's because of the man in charge, Captain Hans Wilhelm Langsdorff. Langsdorff wasn't the typical war commander. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't cruel. In fact, the way he handled these attacks made people take notice. He would intercept the ship, stop it, and make sure every crew member got off safely. He provided food, water, and safe transfer to neutral ports. Some of the captured sailors later said that they had been treated better than they expected, and that they were surprised at how much care was taken to avoid loss of life. For Langsdorff, war didn't mean throwing out humanity. He believed in rules, and he followed them. While all of this was going on, British forces were getting increasingly frustrated. They knew the Graf Spee was out there. They could see the pattern in the attacks. But they couldn't find the ship. It moved fast and far. Its diesel engines meant it didn't need to refuel as often. And it used a supply ship that shadowed it from a distance, bringing food, fuel, and even updates on enemy movements. Every time the British thought they were closing in, the Graf Spee would slip away again. But that couldn't go on forever. In December 1939, the Royal Navy finally got a break. HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles, a squadron of 3 cruisers, managed to track the Graf Spee near the mouth of the River Plate between Argentina and Uruguay. They weren't exactly an even match. The British ships had smaller guns, but they had speed and numbers, and they had no choice. They opened fire. The battle started early on December 13th. It was fast, loud, and brutal. The Graf Spee opened up with its main guns, and right away Exeter took heavy damage. Smoke covered the sea. Gunfire echoed in every direction. The Ajax and Achilles kept their distance, using speed and maneuvering to stay out of the worst of the firing line. But the Graf Spee wasn't invincible. It took hits too. The damage wasn't just to the outer hull. Some of the internal systems were affected. They had fired almost all their bullets and bombs, and there were no spare pieces to fix the broken parts of the ship. Still, the ship wasn't sinking, and Langsdorff got it to safety, at least for the moment. He headed into Montevideo, Uruguay. It was a neutral port, which meant he could stop there, but only for a limited time. According to international law, he had just 72 hours to fix whatever he could before he would be forced to leave. Langsdorff knew his situation was bad. His ship was damaged, his ammo was low, and he had no support nearby. The nearest German naval force was thousands of miles away. On top of that, British intelligence began spreading false reports. They made it look like a massive British fleet was waiting just outside the harbor, ready to sink the Graf Spee the moment it tried to leave. Langsdorff had no way to verify the truth. His ship's radar and radio systems weren't reliable after the battle. He couldn't take the risk. He couldn't escape, and he couldn't fight. If he stayed too long, Uruguay might be pressured to confine his ship, which would leave it useless. So he made a decision that shocked the world. He ordered the Graf Spee to be scuttled. That means he had it destroyed by his own crew so it wouldn't fall into enemy hands. So, on December 17th, the ship was taken just outside the harbor, and with explosives placed carefully along the hull, it was blown apart. Flames reached into the sky. Smoke covered the coastline. Thousands of people in Montevideo watched from the shore as the once powerful warship sank beneath the waves. However, Langsdorff didn't go down with his ship, but he didn't live long after. He moved to Buenos Aires, and just a few days later, he ended his life in a quiet hotel room. He wore his full uniform, he laid on the ship's battle flag, and he left a note explaining that he had done everything he could to protect his crew, even though it meant going against orders from Berlin. His story is one of conflict, not just between nations, but between duty and humanity. And just like that, the Admiral Graf Spee vanished from view. But that was not the end. For decades, the wreck sat at the bottom of the River Plate, partly buried in silt and partly torn apart by the explosion. People in Uruguay remembered it, and divers occasionally visited it. But for the most part, the world moved on. Yet stories about the wreck kept coming. There were rumors about what might still be inside the sealed compartments. People said there were documents, strange equipment, even gold. Others believed the wreck was too dangerous to touch. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that serious talk about salvaging the wreck began. The Uruguayan government approved exploration. A private salvage company stepped in. And soon, divers and engineers were going underwater not just to look, but to bring things up. Their goal wasn't to raise the entire ship. That would have been impossible. Instead, they focused on the most valuable or symbolic pieces. And what they found eventually sparked debates that reached beyond history books and into politics, museums, and headlines. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into what salvage divers actually found and why the world still can't stop talking about it. Dragging the past back to the surface. When salvage divers finally went underwater to inspect the remains of the Admiral Graf Spee, they didn't expect what they saw. The wreck had been lying in the same spot for more than 80 years, yet parts of it still looked powerful. It had been blown apart in 1939, but it was clear that some of the ship's body had remained strong, even after all those years. The steel looked worn, but it still held shape. And buried beneath thick layers of silt and river mud were pieces that hadn't been touched since the day it sank. The water was murky and full of debris, so divers had to move slowly. They used special cameras and underwater mapping tools to figure out what could be lifted and what was too fragile to touch. This wasn't just a dive. It was a careful operation that mixed engineering with archaeology. And even though the team had maps and blueprints of the ship, they quickly realized the wreck didn't match everything they expected. Parts had shifted. Some sections were missing, and others were sealed tight, just like the rumors had always said. However, the first goal was to find recognizable pieces, anything that could be recovered, cleaned, and studied. And in 2004, the divers made their first major breakthrough. They located one of the Graf Spee's 11-inch gun turrets, still partly attached to the lower deck. It was heavy, covered in rust, and stuck in the mud, but the team was determined to bring it up. After weeks of preparation, they lifted it out of the river and into the sunlight. The sight of the massive weapon shocked many across the world. This wasn't just a piece of history, it was a reminder of how powerful the ship once was. But the gun turret was just the beginning. Soon after, the team found something else, something more delicate but just as important as the gun turret. They located the optical rangefinder, a long mechanical tool that had once helped the ship aim its guns with precision. It had lenses, gears, and a finely built metal frame. Even after decades underwater, the tool was mostly intact. Divers carefully disconnected it from the wreck and raised it to the surface. Historians were thrilled. This wasn't just another piece of metal. It was a rare example of 1930s naval technology, and it gave experts new clues about how the Graf Spee operated during combat. But nothing caused as much stir as what came next. In 2006, divers found the Bronze Eagle, the one that once sat at the stern of the ship. It was huge, with its wings stretched wide and a swastika clutched in its claws. When it was lifted out of the water, many were stunned by how well it had survived. The wings were damaged, but the symbol was still visible, and that led to an immediate problem. What do you do with a Nazi artifact this big, this public, and this powerful? The moment the Eagle was pulled from the water, it became more than a historic object. It became a political issue. Some wanted it displayed in a museum, as a way to educate future generations. Others said it should be hidden or even destroyed because of what it represented. However, the Uruguayan government took control of the artifact and locked it away. And to this day, there's still debate about whether it should ever be shown in public again. The controversy over the Eagle showed that the Graf Spee wasn't just a shipwreck. It was a symbol. And symbols can still carry weight, even after being buried for decades. But the salvage team didn't stop there. They continued recovering smaller items too, items that gave a more personal look into the lives of the sailors who once served on the ship. They found spent shell casings, broken pieces of the ship's radio and communication systems, and everyday tools used by the crew. There were cooking pots, razors, and even shoes. These weren't glamorous finds, but they were powerful in their own way. They reminded everyone that this wasn't just a war machine. It had been home to hundreds of men. Each of them had a role. Each of them had routines, tasks, and a life on board that went beyond combat. Some of the items were cleaned and placed in museums. Others remained in storage. But all of them helped fill in gaps in the ship's story. They answered questions about how the Graf Spee functioned day to day. They showed how the crew lived, communicated, and maintained the ship while at sea. And slowly, piece by piece, the ship that had once ruled the Atlantic began to take shape again. Not as a ghost, but as a real, tangible story. Still, large sections of the Graf Spee remain untouched. Some parts of the wreck are buried too deep to reach without risking collapse. Other compartments are still sealed, and no one knows for sure what's inside them. Some believe they're empty, filled only with water and silt, but others believe they could still be hiding things. Maybe documents, maybe equipment, or maybe something unexpected. Because of the ship's unusual design and secretive mission, it's hard to say with certainty. And that mystery keeps many people coming back. Even now, decades after the last battle, many are still fascinated by the Graf Spee. The wreck has become more than a site of interest. It's a piece of living history. It draws historians, divers, researchers, and tourists. Everyone wants to see what remains. Everyone wants to know what's still hidden. And everyone has a theory. But what makes this even more fascinating is that everything we've seen so far, everything from the turrets to the Eagle to the rangefinder, still doesn't tell the whole story. Because there's another side to the Graf Spee that most people haven't heard about, and it has to do with the ship's design, its early missions, its technology, and the role it played even before World War II officially began. You've seen what was recovered. You've seen what was revealed. But here's the most astonishing part. There were hidden technical facts, the radar systems, and the parts of the Graf Spee story that never made the headlines. And you don't want to miss what's next. So stay tuned. What made the Graf Spee so unique? The Graf Spee was classified as a Panzerschiff, or what many called a pocket battleship. But that name was a bit misleading. It was really a hybrid, somewhere between a cruiser and a battleship. And even though it wasn't the largest warship in the ocean, it was built to surprise. It measured around 186 meters in length, had a beam of just over 21 meters, and sat deep in the water with a draft of more than 7 meters. It was slim enough to move fast, but strong enough to take heavy hits, thanks to its 100mm belt armor that protected its sides and a main deck that could absorb blasts from smaller caliber weapons. However, what really set the Graf Spee apart wasn't just its size or its guns. It was what sat inside its hull. Instead of using steam turbines like many other warships of that time, it was powered by diesel engines. That gave it an enormous range, up to 16,000 kilometers without refueling. It could cross oceans, circle enemy convoys, and disappear before anyone knew it was close. And because it ran more efficiently than its rivals, it could stay out at sea for longer stretches, which made it perfect for its mission, which was disrupting Allied supply lines. But there was something else hiding in its metal frame. The Graf Spee carried radar. It was actually the first German warship equipped with a Sea-Takt radar set. That might not sound like much now, but in the late 1930s, that gave it a serious edge. It could detect ships beyond the horizon, even in fog or darkness. It meant the Graf Spee didn't always have to rely on lookouts or chance sightings. It could plan ahead. It could choose when to strike. And most of the ships it hunted never knew it was coming. It even had its own reconnaissance aircraft on board. At first, it was a Heinkel He-60 float plane, and later it was replaced with a more advanced Arado R-196. The plane was launched by catapult and helped scout large sections of the sea. That meant the Graf Spee wasn't just sailing blind. It had eyes in the sky. And while it attacked with brute force, it also used strategy, speed, and information to stay one step ahead. But long before it became famous for its South Atlantic campaign, the Graf Spee had already played a role on the world stage. Between 1936 and 1938, it took part in 5 non-intervention patrols during the Spanish Civil War. Germany used these missions to monitor shipping and flex its growing naval power without entering direct conflict. And in May 1937, the Graf Spee even sailed to Britain to join the coronation review for King George VI. It passed alongside other major warships as a gesture of respect. No one watching that ceremony could have guessed that just 2 years later, this same ship would be scuttled after one of the earliest and most talked about naval battles of World War II. There was also the size of its crew. At the start, it carried around 33 officers and 586 enlisted men. But that number grew as missions became more demanding. By the time it faced the Royal Navy off the coast of Uruguay, it had closer to 1,000 men aboard. They lived, trained, and worked in tight conditions, managing a complex ship full of systems, weapons, and responsibilities. And that's part of what made the wreck feel so human when divers began pulling up relics decades later. These weren't just parts of a machine, they were pieces of a floating community. And there was something symbolic about the ship's name. The Admiral Graf Spee was named after Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee, a World War I naval commander who died in battle with both of his sons by his side. Naming the ship after him was a tribute, but it also carried a message about sacrifice, loyalty, and Germany's desire to rebuild its military pride. When you add up all of this, the engines, the radar, the aircraft, the armor, and the name, you begin to see why the Graf Spee became a legend. It wasn't just a ship that disappeared underwater, it was a message in steel, a design that challenged the rules, and a floating symbol that still sparks arguments and curiosity today. Because sometimes, the most fascinating parts of a story aren't what was recovered, but what was built in the first place. So, what are your thoughts on this? Was the Graf Spee a marvel of its time, or a warning of what happens when you push the rules too far? Drop it in the comment section below. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.